Picture a tax inspector riding into a valley in southern Italy. He has come to count houses because houses mean money for the crown. He crests the hill and looks down at the settlement he was sent to assess. But the town is gone. Where a village should stand, there is only a field of loose grey stone lying in the grass. No roofs, no walls, nothing to tax. He rides home with nothing to report. Behind him, within a day, the village puts itself back together. Roofs rise, chimneys smoke, families move back in. This was no accident, it was a design, and these people had turned their own homes into a trick played on a king. The house was the Trullo, and its greatest secret was that it could be made to disappear. Today we're going to walk into that valley and take the Trullo apart, stone by stone. Why a house built with no mortar at all could outlast the empires that taxed it. How a roof with no frame holds up a cone of solid rock. And why the cleverest thing about these homes was not how they were built, but how fast they could be unbuilt. A modern house is lucky to see a century. Some of these have stood for 3, and the method behind them is far older than that. Start with the ground, because in Puglia, the ground decided everything. This is the heel of Italy, a long spur of limestone reaching into the sea. It is beautiful and it is stubborn. Under a thin skin of red soil, the whole region is rock, and for centuries a farmer clearing a field here was really quarrying it. Every plough turned up stone. To plant anything, you first had to lift out tons of limestone by hand and carry it to the edge of the field. Walk the Itria Valley today, and you can still read that labour in the landscape, in the low, dry walls that divide every plot and the round stone huts standing in the corners of fields. Shelters for tools and shepherds built by the same hands and the same method as the houses. So the people of the valley had a problem and a resource that were the same thing. They had almost no timber, because the land would not grow the great forests that framed houses elsewhere in Europe. What they had instead was an endless supply of flat, hard, easily split stone, already stacked at the edge of every field by the simple act of farming. A house had to be made of the one material they could not get rid of. The Trullo was not an inspired invention dropped on the valley from nowhere. It was the honest answer to what the land handed them, worked out and refined over generations until a farmer could raise one with his family and his neighbours, and no outside help at all. That answer started with the walls, and the first surprise is that they used no mortar to bind them. A Trullo wall is a double wall, 2 skins of carefully chosen stone with a core of loose rubble and earth packed between them, and the whole thing can be a metre thick or more at the base. Nothing glues it. It holds together through weight, friction, and the patience of a builder who knows exactly which stone sits on which face goes out, which edge locks the one beside it. The mass does the work. Those thick walls soak up the fierce Puglian sun through the day and release it slowly at night, so the inside of a Trullo stays cool in a summer that bakes the fields outside and holds warmth through the winter. No furnace, no insulation, no clever machinery. Just stone doing what stone does when you use enough of it. Inside, a single Trullo was usually one round room under one cone, the walls whitewashed bright against the gloom, with deep arched alcoves cut into the thickness of the stone for a bed, a hearth, a store of food. When a family grew, they did not extend the house sideways in the way we would. They simply built another cone beside the first and broke a doorway through, and then another, so a large Trullo home became a little cluster of linked stone domes, each one raised the same patient way. Life inside one of those cones was simple and close. A single round room held nearly everything: the fire, the table, the bed folded into its stone alcove, the family, and often the year's grain and oil sealed away in the thickness of the walls themselves. In the heat of a Puglian summer, the Trullo was a cool, shadowed refuge from a sun that could crack the fields outside, and in the damp of winter, its heavy mass held onto what little warmth a small fire could give. The floor was frequently bare rock, and a single narrow window let in one slot of light. It was not comfort as we would think of it, but it was shelter that asked almost nothing and gave back a great deal, year after year, one generation handing it to the next. The men who knew how to close a cone were called trullari, and they were the closest thing this world had to engineers. A family could quarry the stone and raise the walls themselves, but the roof was where skill and lives were on the line, and a master builder was brought in to judge the pitch of the corbelling by eye and settle the capstone. A raising was a village affair. Neighbours carried stone, women fed the workers, and the whole community watched the cone climb ring by ring, because everyone in the valley knew that the difference between a roof that stood for centuries and a roof that killed a family was a matter of a few degrees, read by a man with no drawings and no instruments, only a lifetime of watching other cones go up. The knowledge lived in hands and eyes and got handed down the way a language does, from one generation to the next, never written and never lost. But a thick wall is the easy part. Anyone can stack stone into a circle. The hard part, the part that turns a hut into a marvel, was putting a roof over that circle without a single beam of wood. This is where the Trullo stops being a clever cottage and becomes a genuine feat of engineering. The roof is a cone, and it is made entirely of stone, and there is no wooden frame underneath holding it up. It holds itself up using a technique called corbelling that is older than almost anything else in this story. The builder lays a ring of flat limestone slabs on top of the wall, each one jutting inward just slightly beyond the ring below it. Then another ring, a little further in, then another. Each course steps toward the centre, and because each stone is weighed down by the stones behind and above it, none of them tip inward and fall. The rings spiral upward and close, tighter and tighter, until a single capstone drops into the gap at the very top and locks the whole cone shut. There is more cleverness hidden in that cone than you can see from below. On the better trulli, the roof is really two shells, an inner dome of rougher stone that carries the load and shapes the ceiling, and an outer skin of thin limestone plates laid over it to throw off the weather. Those outer plates, called ciancarelli, were set to overlap like the scales of a fish, each one tilted so that rain runs down the outside of the cone and never finds its way in. The water was not wasted either. It was guided off the roof and down into a cistern cut below the house, because in a land this dry, every drop of rain was worth catching. A roof with no timber, no nails, and no mortar, that keeps out sun and storm and quietly harvests its own water. Get the angle of the corbelling wrong by a few degrees, and the whole cone comes down on the family sleeping under it. Get it right, and it stands for 300 years. And the reason it has no mortar turns out to be the strangest part of the whole story. Because the missing mortar was not only about what the land could provide, it was also about what a landlord wanted to hide. To understand it, you have to meet the man who ruled this valley. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the land around what is now Alberobello belonged to the Counts of Conversano, the powerful Acquaviva family, and the most notorious of them, Gian Girolamo II, was a warlord known across the region as the Squint Eye of Puglia. He wanted this valley worked and productive. What he did not want was to tell his king about it. The Kingdom of Naples, which he answered to, taxed new settlements, and founding a new town on your land meant asking the crown's permission and paying the crown's price. The count wanted the peasants and their labour and their harvest. He did not want the tax, and he did not want to ask leave to have them there at all, and here is the real reason those houses had no mortar. The count is said to have ordered his tenants to build only in dry stone, with no binding of any kind, precisely so the houses were not legally permanent structures. A pile of stacked stones was not a town in the eyes of the law. It was just stone lying on the land, no different from the walls around the fields. When word came that a royal inspector was riding out from Naples to check whether an unlicensed settlement had sprung up where none was allowed, the order went through the valley, and the people climbed their roofs, pulled the keystone from each cone, and let their own homes collapse into heaps of rubble. The inspector rode in, found a scatter of loose stone and empty ground, and rode away with nothing to report. Once he was safely gone, the cones went back up, ring by ring, and the families moved home. A whole town that could be unbuilt in an afternoon and rebuilt in a day, all to stay invisible to a king who was never told it existed. That is the tradition at least, and it is worth being honest that it is partly legend, argued over by historians who point out that dry stone building was the natural local method long before any tax was dodged, but the legend fits the stones too well to wave away. The very thing that makes a Trullo so easy to pull down, its complete lack of mortar, is exactly the feature a landlord hiding a settlement from the crown would have prized. Whether it was invented as a tax trick or simply used as one, the two things had become the same thing. Engineering and evasion built into the same wall. If watching this makes you want to put your own hands on the past instead of just watching it, that is the whole idea behind the Medieval Way store. It starts with the Medieval Bakery Collection. The Practical Recipes book walks you through the dishes themselves. The Sourdough Manual is for keeping a living leaven the old way, and the Sourcing Guide tells you where to find real heritage grain. The bread is where this kitchen begins. Now look back up at the top of that cone, because there is a signature waiting there. Almost every Trullo is finished with a carved pinnacle, a stone knob or ball or disc set on the capstone, and no two are quite the same. Some are simple spheres. Some are stacked shapes, crosses, crescents, little pierced ornaments cut by hand. One reading is that these were the personal mark of the master builder who raised the roof, his signature closing the seal on his work, so a family could look up and know whose hands had kept them dry. Another is that they were charms, set there to guard the house and the family inside it from bad luck and the evil eye. Most likely they were both at once, practical pride and quiet superstition sitting on the same stone. The roofs carried marks of their own. Many were painted in whitewashed lime with symbols laid straight onto the grey slate of the cone: a cross, a heart, a pierced sun, a crescent moon, letters, and older signs whose meaning has slipped away from us. Some were plainly Christian, some were far older than any church, some were simply a household's private meaning, a thing they understood and we never will. A traveller walking the streets of the town could read a whole language of protection and belief written across the rooftops above his head. These were not decoration added once the work was done. They were part of how a family said, out loud in stone and lime, "This house is ours, and it is watched over." The trulli were practical to the bone, and still the people living in them reached for something beyond the practical. So how did a house like this outlive the empires that taxed it? By being too humble and too tough to be worth destroying. The trick with the collapsing roofs did not last forever, and in the end the people themselves ended it. In 1797, tired of living in homes they were forbidden to make permanent, the people of the valley appealed over the count's head directly to the crown, and Ferdinand IV of Naples granted their request and declared their settlement a free royal town. It took the name Alberobello. From that day the houses could be permanent and legal, mortar was allowed where they wanted it, and the reason to build a home that could vanish on command was gone for good. But the houses stayed, long after the powers that shaped them did not. The kingdom of Naples itself did not survive. Napoleon came and went. The old southern kingdom was swallowed into a newly unified Italy in 1861. Kings, counts, and whole states rose and fell across those same centuries, and through all of it the trulli of the Itria Valley simply stood there, cool in summer, dry in the rain, holding up their cones of stacked stone without a nail or a beam or a drop of cement. The method behind them turned out to be almost unkillable because it was never really new. Corbelled stone domes like these reach back thousands of years to the beehive tombs and shepherds' huts of the ancient Mediterranean, a way of closing a roof that people had known since long before Rome. The Trullo was one of the last places that knowledge stayed alive and in daily use. There was a stretch in the 19th century when the valley grew rich on wine, and even then, with money in their pockets, the people kept building the old cones, because nothing else kept a house so cool through a Pullian August, or cost so little to raise from the fields around it. When the vines later failed and the money left, the trulli were still there, still shelter, still standing. That is the pattern of the whole story. The economy that could have replaced them never quite did, because the humble stone cone kept quietly outperforming whatever was supposed to come next. In 1996, the trulli of Alberobello were named a World Heritage Site, protected now not as poor men's shelters, but as one of the final living examples of a building tradition older than the empires it survived. For a long time, none of this was treasured. Well into the 20th century, the trulli were seen by many as an embarrassment, the cramped and primitive housing of a poor rural south that the modern world was trying its best to leave behind. Families who could afford to moved out into square, mortared houses with proper upper floors, and left the old cones to the past. What saved them in the end was the very quality that had once shamed them. They were strange, and they were beautiful, and there was nowhere else on earth quite like a whole town of stone cones crowded along a hillside. Travellers started coming just to see them. The houses that had once marked a family as too poor for a real home became the reason the wider world finally showed up at the door. That is the quiet thing about the Trullo. We tend to assume the buildings that last are the grand ones, the cathedrals and palaces raised by rich men who meant to be remembered. The Trullo was the opposite of all that. It was built by people with almost nothing, out of the one material their land would not stop giving them, in a shape so old that nobody can say who first thought of it, and it was designed at one point to be knocked flat on a landlord's command. And yet it is the Trullo that is still standing, still lived in, still shedding rain into its cistern, long after the empire that tried to tax it turned to dust. So maybe the real question is not how these houses lasted so long. Maybe it is why we ever assumed the humble ones wouldn't. Subscribe to Medieval Way, where we dig up the building history forgot to knock down. Which surprised you most, the stone roof or the tax dodge? Until next time.